Well, we are in week 2 of our series that we started last week. We're going through the book of Philippians. And if you were with us last week, we handed out over 500 packs of juicy fruit. Did y'all get your juicy fruit last week? Yeah, and so it's been really cool. I've heard stories from people about how their juicy fruit is now messing with their life. And let me just go ahead and tell you one of my stories, because of course my words came back to bite me from last week as I stood up here on the platform. This past week, Friday's usually our day off, and we usually go out for breakfast, my wife and I, and we were in traffic in downtown Grand Rapids. And there's a section where you go from 131 to like 96, and there's a really, really long entrance section where you're going from 131 to get onto 96, but it's double lined, so you can't cross over to merge into traffic until you get to the dotted line. And so we were making this merge, and we were moving on to 96, and I was being a good follower of Jesus. I was staying in my lane the way I was supposed to. I did not cross over the double line. And the person behind me, though, chose not to follow Jesus that day. And what they did is they crossed over the double line. And so they got over, they merged into traffic long before they were supposed to. And I waited until we got to the dotted line, and it was my turn to merge. But the problem was I couldn't merge because the unfollower of Jesus who had recently merged too early was in my space, the space that technically, legally was for me to merge into. And so I decided I had an opinion about his driving. And he couldn't hear me. His windows were up. My windows were up. But I decided to share my opinion with him anyways. And so as I was trying to merge like a lawful Jesus-following citizen would. And I'm telling you, as soon as I was done voicing my opinion about his driving ability or his driving choices, I'm telling you, it was as if the thought was literally attached right to my opinion. It just boomed right out of my head. That wasn't very fruity, was it, Aaron? And so if you were with us last week, that makes sense. I would really encourage you. So now I have one of these on the dash of my car. I have one on my nightstand. I have one on my desk in my office. I will probably have 25 of these packs laying all over my life by the time this series is over, but that's the point. And if you weren't with us last week, I would really encourage you to go back and watch last week's message. And if you did not get a pack of juicy fruit, there are some in the back. We had a few more come in, and so if you missed out on that, grab that. But just know it's going to mess with your life during these 8 weeks, during this series. So, well, we are in week 2, and so we're going to pick up right where we left off last week. We're working our way through the book of Philippians, and so we started in Philippians chapter 1, right at verse 1. We're actually going to pick up in just a moment at verse 12, but let me start with a question this morning. What is the hardest thing you've ever been through in life? If you just maybe think about that, get that in your head, get that in your heart. And depending on your age, your stage of life, where you've been, where you've come from, kind of the experiences you've had, the answers to that are probably really, really different. But just what's the hardest thing you've ever been through in life? If you're still in high school, maybe it's just we lost the state championship in basketball, or my girlfriend or boyfriend who I'd been dating for the last 2-3 years broke up with me, and that feels like that's the hardest thing you've been through in life, and perhaps for you that is. Maybe it's a job loss. After working for the same company for decades, they let you go, and it's unexpected, and you have to say goodbye to all of your friends and to all of the people that you spent 40, 50 hours a week with. Perhaps it's a diagnosis. And it's a really difficult diagnosis that is going to change your life forever. And just hearing the diagnosis has become the hardest thing that you've had to deal with, or now you're living with and through the diagnosis, and that has become the hardest thing that you've had to live with. Most of you know Allie Lafferty, my assistant here, and I asked for permission just to sort of briefly mention this. A couple of years ago, they went through the hardest thing they've gone through in their life when they lost their son to a tragic accident. And I think Allie would even say it continues to be the hardest thing that they've ever gone through in their life. And one of the questions that I want to wrestle with this morning, and this is what Paul's going to help us wrestle with, is what do you do in those moments? What do you do when you're confronted with a hardship, when you're confronted with a setback, when you're confronted with something that feels like life is now making you suffer through life? You've lost someone that you love deeply, or it is the diagnosis, or it is a relational breakup. How do you respond when life gives you a setback, when there's a hardship, or it just feels like you're in this place of complete and total suffering with what is happening in your life? And the Apostle Paul, as we pick up where we left off last week, is actually going to show us how he responded to the hardships, the setbacks, and the sufferings that he endured. Again, if you were with us last week, you know that the Apostle Paul has been arrested, so we'll talk about that more in just a minute, but he has gone through it. Prior to his arrest that we're sort of peeking into as we get started in the book of Philippians, he was mobbed. He has been mobbed by people. He has been beaten by people. He's had stones thrown at him. He tells us he has been whipped over and over and over again, all simply for proclaiming the story of Jesus Christ. And it stands to reason that what Paul has gone through and is going through in the letter of Philippians would be considered a hardship, a setback, or suffering. And because suffering is it's just a part of life, it's just a part of what we go through, I think it's so good for us to peek into this part of Paul's letter and say, Paul, how did you respond to it? And so we're going to go to Philippians chapter 1, verse 12. That's where we left off last week. But actually, I'm going to fast forward all the way. You don't have to go there in your Bible just yet, but I'm going to fast forward all the way to the end of chapter 1, because I just want you to read. This is how the Apostle Paul ends the first part of his letter. In Philippians chapter 1, verse 29, he says, it's been granted to you, he's talking to believers like you and I, on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. In other words, if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, you have to believe in him. That's the believe part. But then he says, but I also just want you to know you're going to suffer. You're going to suffer for Christ. And just for me, I read that and I go, Paul, you're not really selling this whole Christianity thing with that line right there, right? If this is your marketing slogan, if this is how you're trying to get people to follow Jesus, that listen, you're just going to suffer, 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 I'm not sure that's the best way to do that. I'd dial back and rethink your marketing. But I don't think Paul is really saying anything we don't already know or haven't already experienced. Being a follower of Jesus may very well bring some extra suffering to life, but what Paul is actually saying is that to be human is to suffer. Suffering, setbacks, hardships in life, they're a part of the human experience. They're a part of what it means to walk on this earth. But how do we respond to the setbacks? What do we do when hardship is put on us? How do we respond when we're faced with a suffering that in our life that we never, ever, ever expected nor ever, ever wanted in our life? And this is what Paul is going to teach us as we move forward in this letter. So if you have a Bible, first Philippians chapter 1, verse 12, we're going to go back to that. The YouVersion Bible app is a great way to follow along as well. But we're going to pick right up where we left off last week, and here's where Paul starts. He says, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. Now remember, what has happened to him is that he's in prison. He's been arrested. And the crime that he's committed is he won't shut up about Jesus. He just keeps preaching the gospel. He just keeps talking about Jesus and proclaiming that Jesus is the way to heaven, is the way to God. It's how you're made right with God. And that's what he is arrested for. And not only is he in prison, but he's awaiting a trial. And the trial could very well take his life. More than likely, Paul is in Rome as he writes the letter to the Philippian church. He's probably on house arrest. So not as bad as being in prison, but he's chained to a Roman guard 24 hours a day. And at any moment, the Roman officials could walk in, they could take Paul to the court, or they could just take him to the execution court, and they could just end his life right here, right now. And what Paul says to you and I is that what has happened, this arrest, the trial that I'm awaiting, the beatings that I have endured, the mobs of people that have tried to take my life, just sort of all of it collectively, what has happened to me has actually served to advance the story of Jesus. Now, I don't think any one of us would blame Paul if instead of saying what has happened to me, he said something along the lines of, why is this happening to me? And the reason we wouldn't blame Paul is because that's exactly what we would ask. If we found ourselves in prison unjustly, or if we lost someone that we love deeply, or if we got a diagnosis that is going to forever alter our life, or if we've had a relational breakup or breakdown, the human soul just longs to know why. And none of us would blame Paul for a second if rather than writing his letter to the Philippians, he was like, what has happened to me? He said, listen, I love God and all that, but I want to know why. And not only that, but none of us would blame Paul if he was just flat out angry at what has happened to him. None of us would hold it against Paul if he just had this sense of holy outrage that he's given his life for the gospel. He's given his life to plant churches and to further the story of Jesus. And for doing that, he's in prison awaiting a trial that could take his life. Nobody would blame Paul if he had this sense of resentment towards God. And the truth is, we probably wouldn't blame you if that happened as well. And yet, Paul, when we read this letter, last week I just sort of mentioned it, one of the things that's present throughout the entire letter of Philippians is this sense of joy. We'll see it in this part here. It's just joy on top of joy on top of joy. He has this completely different perspective on the setback and the suffering that he's living through. And the Philippian letter is not the only place he writes about it. In fact, in his letter to the church in Rome, look at what he writes to the Romans. He says, and we know that in all things, let me just define all things for you. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's the beautiful and the wonderful, and it's the hardship and the setback and the suffering. That's all things. Paul says, we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purposes. He just says that it doesn't, whatever is happening in life, good, bad, beautiful, ugly, setbacks and suffering, God can take all of it and somehow work it into good, bring good from it. This is the mindset of Paul as he's sitting in prison, awaiting a trial that could take his life. And one of the things that Paul teaches us, and I think this is important for us to hear, especially if we find ourselves in a setback in life, especially if we find ourselves in one of those seasons where we are suffering through it, whatever the it is. What Paul is teaching us in his letter to the Philippians, but even here, just in this moment as he writes to the Romans, is that our circumstances, listen to me, our circumstances do not determine the character of God. Just let that one hit your heart for a second. The circumstances, good, bad, or ugly, do not determine the character of God. And that's why I say it would have been reasonable for Paul to just be angry or upset, or to even accuse God of being unloving, uncaring, or God has just stopped paying attention to Paul because now he's in a prison after giving his life for Jesus and for the gospel. Now I'm here, my circumstances are telling me that God is no longer good and he's no longer loving. Yet that's not what Paul writes ever. In Philippians or in Romans, he says things like, all things worked for the good. And it's because he realizes that the character of God is not based on our circumstances. just as important, what Paul knows then, is that it's the cross of Christ that determines the character of God. It's this here. It is the cross of Christ, because whenever I find myself up against a hardship, whenever I find myself up against a setback or in a moment of suffering, it's very easy for me. And I remember a couple of years ago when I was going through my cancer journey, I remember being in the hospital. I was only supposed to be there for 3 days. I was there for 3 weeks. It was one of the most painful, physically painful experiences I've ever been through. And I remember sitting in the hospital asking, why is this happening to me? Because that's just the question that resonates in our heart. Why is this happening to me? And for a sliver of a moment going, I wonder if God is even paying attention. I wonder if he even cares that I'm going through this. And I began to question the character of God based on my circumstances. And then my wife would come in and she would write these Bible verses on the marker board that I had in my hospital room. And every time she would write it up there, she'd write a verse about the cross of Jesus Christ. And I just remembered, no. It is the cross of Christ that determines the character of God. And I would have to bring myself to the foot of the cross and go, wait a second, this is where he proves he loves me. This is where he proves he's paying attention to the brokenness in the world, even if it doesn't feel like it sometimes. This is where his compassion and his justice and his mercy and his grace is poured out. And I just think it's important for us to remember that. And it's not meant to diminish the very real suffering that a lot of us go through in the circumstances in our life. But just remember, it is the cross of Christ that determines the character of God wherever you're at in life. And so, what Paul's doing as he writes this letter to the Philippians is he's actually teaching us to just ask a different question. The natural human question is the why one. Why is this happening to me? We never once hear Paul ask that question throughout his letter. None of his letters. Rather, what you see through the life of Paul, what you see as he continues to write this letter is, what can God do with what is happening to me? I wonder what God can do with the hardship, with the setback, with the suffering in my life. So remember, he's in prison. He's chained to a Roman guard. And what we know from the letter, both in the book of Acts and from Philippians, is that when it's the Roman guard that he's being watched over by is the Roman Praetoria. This is the guard that is responsible for guarding Caesar, the king, for guarding senators, for overwatching Rome, and there's over 4,000 members in this particular guard. And every 4 hours, Paul is assigned a new Roman guard. So every 4 hours, there's a switch over, and a new guard comes in, and 4 hours, a new guard comes in, and they chain themselves to Paul. So they don't just come in and sort of babysit him. There's chains linking Paul to this Roman guard. We know that Paul was on house arrest in Rome for 2 years. That's 2 years. Every 4 hours, a different Roman guard is assigned to Paul. I'm not a great mathematician, but that's over 4,000 possible guards who have to sit in the room with Paul while he reads his Bible, while he prays, while he preaches, if only to himself. And I'm not suggesting that there were 4,000. I'm sure they had some repeat soldiers that came in. The Roman Praetoria was broken up into detachments of about 500 soldiers. So maybe he was assigned just this one detachment. But in 2 years, every 4 hours, how many people sat just feet away from Paul, while he recited the gospel, while he prayed to God in heaven. Other people were allowed to come and see Paul while he was there so Paul could train them up or preach to them. And over and over and over again, these Roman guards are hearing the gospel preached. How many of those Roman guards do you think walked out of that room over those 2 years thinking, maybe this Jesus thing is real and this whole Rome thing is just temporary and fading? How many people might see Jesus through your suffering, through your setback, through your hardship, and they see how you respond, and they walk away saying, maybe this Jesus thing is real, and this whole earth and world thing is just temporary and fading. So when Paul says, what's happened to me has actually happened to serve the gospel, God is using this to do something bigger than I could ever have imagined. This isn't just a verse that Paul writes. This is literally happening to him in the moment. He's watching it unfold. And it is so important that Paul doesn't get stuck in asking, why has this happened to me? Why has this happened to me? Why has this happened to me? Because I think one of the things we risk, if we get stuck asking the why question, one of the things we risk is the pain that we're enduring in our hardship, in our setback, in our suffering. The pain that we're enduring actually becomes our prison. I mean, Paul's literally in a prison cell, or he's on house arrest in prison, and Paul says, I refuse to have a second prison over my life. This one is bad enough. I refuse to let the pain and the suffering and the hardship that I have endured become a prison. And what I mean by that is we can let that pain become anger. That just seeps into our heart. And before long, anger turns to bitterness. And before long, it turns to resentment. And if you've ever met somebody who is deeply, deeply bitter or resentful, if you think about it, they're in a prison. And Paul says, the suffering is real. It's a part of life. But I want to know, God, what can you do with what's happening to me? And when you ask that question, and listen, it's a hard question to ask when you are going through it. I get that. But when we ask that question, what we're actually saying to God is, God, would you take my suffering and turn it into a story worth telling? Would you take the suffering of my life and would you turn it into a story worth telling? And now listen, this is so important. Because if you can get to this place, with whatever it is, the setback, the hardship, the suffering, if you can put it before God and say, God, what are you doing in the midst of all of this? And God, I just take my suffering and turn it into, what you're saying to God is you're giving God permission to reach into your suffering. You're giving God permission to reach into your loss, to reach into your pain and your anger. You're giving God permission to reach into your outrage and your doubt. And you're asking God to bring healing. You're asking God to bring hope, and you're asking God to bring wholeness. Why is a fair question? But God, would you take my suffering and turn it into a story worth telling is an invitation. And it is an invitation to that God. The one who gave up his life on the cross and proved his character to us. To bring healing, hope, and wholeness. So here's what happened to Paul. Here's what Paul says happened. He says, as a result of what? As a result of my imprisonment, as a result of what's happened to me, as a result of, God, what do you want to do with this? It's a reality. It's a part of my life. God, what do you want to do with this? As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard. There it is, 4,000 soldiers. The whole palace guard, and to everyone else, that I'm in chains for Christ. Verse 14, and because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. He says, because of my chains. And listen, I don't want to correct Paul or necessarily argue with Paul, but here's what I would add to what he says. It's not just because of his chains that people are having a deeper understanding of who Jesus is. It's because of Paul's response to his chains. They see the way Paul is responding to the suffering. They see the way Paul is responding to the setback and the hardship. And over this last year, although I wasn't here just yet, when the Lafferty family lost their son, I wasn't here for that. This last year, I have sat with Allie just to get to know her because she is my assistant and she does a lot of work that I don't want to do. And so I just appreciate her for that so very much. But I've also just gotten to know her story. Tell me about that moment. Tell me about what happened. Tell me about what you've gone through. And for the last year, I have gotten to see how she and her family have responded. And she continues to respond with grace, with courage, with trust. And you know what else? Some of the most significant conversations that her and I have had have been, I want God to use my story. I want God to use my suffering. And I want him to use it to further his story. That's the question she's asking. God, what do you want to do with what has happened to me? See, the people, they saw his chains, but what they also saw was how he responded with courage as he was wearing the chains. They saw his suffering, but what they also saw was how he responded with strength. They saw the pain that he had gone through, but what they saw was how he responded, knowing that God had a purpose for all of it. And there's just something powerful when you allow God to move and work in your suffering and shape your suffering into a story worth telling. And so Paul says, it's because of my chains that most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord. And they dare. Now they're telling people about Jesus. Now they're living with courage. Now they're living with strength. Now they're living with a greater sense of purpose than they had before. And then Paul says this, and this to me is just mind-blowing. I will continue to rejoice. There it is. I told you it was in there. Just this overwhelming theme of joy throughout the whole letter. And it's because he trusts in the character of God, even in the midst of his suffering. I'm just going to continue to rejoice. He says, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me, that's where we started. He's gone right back to what has happened to him. What has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. And I don't want us to miss something here that I think is really, really important for us to hear as a church collectively. Paul says, I know that through your prayers. He assumes and believes that the Philippian church is praying for him in his suffering. He assumes and believes that the Philippian church is praying for him in his setback and in his hardship. And church, this is why it is so incredibly important that we are praying with and for each other. It's why we've developed a prayer chain that when you submit prayers, we have people praying for you and with you throughout the week. It's why we're working to develop a prayer team, a group of people dedicated to praying with and for each other. But don't miss this, because he says, through your prayers, and then he says, and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. And what I want to suggest to you here is that what Paul is doing for us is he's linking the prayers of the people in the church to the provision of God's Spirit for him. In other words, your prayers may be the very thing that provides the courage your neighbor is going through as they suffer. Don't miss that. Your prayers may be the very thing that provides the hope that your family member or your loved one, as they lay in the hospital bed, facing the diagnosis or the treatment or the surgery or whatever it is, your prayers may be the thing that sends the spirit of hope to them when they need it most in that suffering moment. And this is why it is incredibly important that we're praying with each other and for each other. You may be the provision. Your prayer may be the provision that someone needs in their moment of suffering. And then he said, it'll turn out for my deliverance. I know that all of this, whatever is happening, all of this hardship, all of this setback, these prison chains, the fact that I'm in prison, the trial, all of it will turn out for my deliverance. And what he means there is, I just believe, trust, and know that God is going to take my suffering and he's going to turn it into a story worth telling. And we are here 2,000 years later still talking about it. That's a story worth telling. So, as the worship team just makes their way back out here, what's your hardship? What's the setback that you're up against right now? What's the suffering that you find yourself wrestling with right now? And can I encourage you, one, that regardless of what it looks like, to always remember that the character of God is found at the foot of the cross. That even in the midst of the most difficult thing you could possibly go through, that cross proves that God is still good, he is still loving, he is still compassionate, even if it doesn't feel that way. But can I encourage you in this moment, would you allow the God of the universe to take your suffering and turn it into a story worth telling? Are you willing to turn it over to him? Are you willing to turn that suffering over, that hardship, that setback, whatever it is, over to him and say, God, as much as I want to just ask why, I want to put it before you. And God, I want to know what you can do with it, and then I want you to turn it into a story worth telling. So I want to pray for you. And maybe in this moment you'll just turn that over to the cross. Heavenly Father, as we are gathered together here in this place, because we're just humans, here's what we just know, that there are people watching online or people in this room right now who are up against it. There is a struggle, there is a setback, there is a hardship, there may very well be a suffering. And Heavenly Father, one, I just pray you'll give us the courage to just really submit that story, to submit that suffering and that hardship to you. And then God, my prayer is that you would, one, breathe life and hope and courage and strength into the suffering. But two, God, I pray that you would take our suffering and that you would just turn it into a story worth telling. That somehow, God, you would use the tragedies, the heartbreaks, the sufferings to help us tell the story of your Son, Jesus Christ. And so, God, we offer this up to you. We love you, and we pray for all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.